Thus Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Joram, with all Israel, had been on guard at Ramoth-Gilead against King Hazael of Aram. But King Joram had returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. So Jehu said, "If this is your wish, then let no one slip out of the city to go and tell the news in Jezreel." Then Jehu mounted his chariot and went to Jezreel, where Joram was lying ill. King Azariah of Judah had come down to visit Joram. In Jezreel, the sentinel standing on the tower spied the company of Jehu arriving and said, "I see a company." Joram said, "Take a horseman, send him to meet them, and let him say, 'Is it peace?'" So the horseman went to meet him. He said, "Thus says the king, 'Is it peace?'" Jehu responded, "What have you to do with peace? Fall in behind me." The sentinel reported, saying, "The messenger reached them, but he is not coming back." Then he sent out a second horseman, who came to them and said, "Thus says the king, 'Is it peace?'" Jehu answered, "What have you to do with peace? Fall in behind me." Again the sentinel reported, "He reached them, but he is not coming back. It looks like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi, for he drives like a maniac." One of the distinctive things about the northern kingdom of Israel in the Bible is that, though it had some very successful kings, it never really succeeded in creating a dynasty that lasted. A generation or two, maybe three, would go by, and somebody would get angry or greedy and decide to take down the ruling house and replace it. That doesn't seem to have happened in the southern kingdom of Judah, where the house of David ruled in an uninterrupted chain throughout the existence of the kingdom. At least, that's the official story. Though, if you have listened to my previous episodes, you know that I have a few doubts about that. But in any case, up in the kingdom of Israel, it seems like it was just one coup after another. But most of them are just noted in passing, and no details are given. Jehu's coup against Joram is different. It is first proposed by God in the time of Elijah, but Elijah, surprisingly, does not follow through on God's command that he anoint Jehu and kick the coup off. Then we have a wild blow-by-blow story of how it all went down in 2 Kings chapter 9. Finally, the coup is summed up as a disaster by another prophet, Hosea, who names his son Jezreel and announces that God will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel and will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Yes, he credits Jehu's coup with the ultimate destruction of the entire kingdom. So, this coup was a big deal. It is also quite a story. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.21. He's a maniac. Maniac! Jehu, the grandson of Nimshi, loved to feel the wind in his hair. He would get up early and order the stable hands to hitch his horses to his chariot. And he would go out and ride through the hills and valleys around Samaria. He had a pair of fine, strong horses, and he loved to drive them himself and give them their head. They would run so fast that his chariot would shake and shimmy, and he would often take the corners on one wheel. But he didn't care. Sometimes it was the only thing that made him feel alive. People noticed, of course, and they often remarked on it. They would see a chariot whirling by, raising up a cloud of dust so large that it hid the driver's face. But they still knew who it was. "It looks like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi," they would say, "for he drives like a maniac." But again, Jehu didn't mind that. He kind of liked it. It gave him the reputation of someone who was capable of doing just about anything. He loved the image it gave him, but the reality was that he mostly went for rides like this because his days were so frustrating. Jehu was an important military commander for King Joram. He had served the king's father, Ahab, in the same capacity. And so he had had a front row seat to watch the steady degradation of a once strong dynasty. The kingdom had been strong and prosperous, but Jehu had been forced to watch as it all came apart. In his view, the alliance of Israel with Tyre to the north had been a shameful thing, something that made Israel weak and subservient. The Israelites' alliance with Judah to the south, a much weaker kingdom that Joram had fallen into the habit of treating like an equal partner, was also a sore point. Jehu felt as if everyone was laughing at them on the world stage. The whole business had come to a head with the disastrous decision to go all in on an invasion of Aram Damascus. This had led to an embarrassing defeat in which the young king had been wounded. And Jehu had had a front row seat for all of it. He couldn't stop thinking about how he would have done things differently, and so much better. But he had made solemn oaths and promises to obey the king, no matter what. He could dream of making the kingdom of Israel great again all he wanted, but he could do nothing about it. And so he took all of his pent-up energy and brilliant ideas out on these wild rides. He shouted into the air all of the things he wanted to say to the king, but couldn't. Some days, spending even a few minutes out in his chariot was the only thing that kept him sane. So let them all say that he drove like a maniac. Let them run and hide when his horses came galloping by. And let them sneeze and cough at the dust that he stirred up. At least, when he was done, he could remove his riding cloak and go and stand in the presence of the king, and he could manage not to cringe at almost everything he saw in the royal court. Thanks to the wild rides, nobody knew. At least, Jehu was pretty sure that nobody knew what he was really thinking on the inside. He's a maniac. It was just a regular meeting of the King's War Council. Nothing important was on the agenda. They were just going over the deployment of the troops and the replacement of some equipment. Things had been pretty quiet since the embarrassing battle against King Hazael at Ramoth Gilead. As he looked around the room, Jehu realized that everyone else was feeling just as discouraged as he was. The situation had sucked the energy out of just about everybody. But he also noticed something else. In recent times, there had been a lack of leadership from above. Young King Joram had not been giving bold directions, and the government had been operating on cruise control. In this vacuum, Jehu had been increasingly stepping up, just to keep things going. But as this meeting progressed, he was realizing just how much the others were taking his leadership for granted. When he proposed a course of action, they all agreed to it immediately. When he criticized someone else's idea, everyone else suddenly found all kinds of reasons for why it wouldn't work. This was interesting. If things continued like this, surely people would soon start to wonder what they needed the king for. All of this was enough to make Jehu start to dream of a new destiny. But at the same time, he was a practical man. He knew that the important people of the kingdom would not flock to his banner simply because he was a more competent leader. They owed too much to the house of Omri, which had made them rich. They would need a good reason, something truly scandalous, to turn away from Joram and towards Jehu. But what? That was something to think about. The young man, one of the company of the prophets, which had been stirring up such trouble in the region around Gilead, burst right into the middle of the council meeting. He seemed little more than a boy, and for a moment was overwhelmed to suddenly find himself amid such powerful company. But he quickly recovered, cleared his throat, and said, "I have a message for you, Commander." "For which of us?" Jehu asked, hesitant to embrace the leadership role that everyone else seemed to be offering him. But the young man was insistent. "For you, Commander." So Jehu got up and went inside to speak alone with him. Once the door had been shut, the prophet took something out from beneath his cloak. It was a horn filled with some liquid. He nervously fumbled with the cork until he finally got it open. He then poured the contents, aromatic oil, all over Jehu's hair as he recited the words that had been given to him. "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of Yahweh, over Israel. You shall strike down the house of your master Ahab, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of Yahweh." Jehu stood there in disbelief as the oil seeped into his ears and mouth. He felt as if all of his private thoughts had been suddenly exposed. He was no fool. He was aware that the company of the prophets had been feuding with the house of Omri for years. They had been trying to promote this God of theirs, this Yahweh, rebranding him as the God of Israel, and demanding that he be worshipped to the exclusion of all others. But he didn't understand why he should get caught up in their holy war. What was in it for him? But the young prophet was not yet finished. "For the whole house of Ahab shall perish," he went on with Yahweh's words. "I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. The dog shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and no one shall bury her." That last thing he said did catch Jehu's attention. What was that about Jezebel, Ahab's wife, who was still powerful in the position of Queen Mother? She had never been as popular as the king. People had never trusted her as a foreigner who didn't understand the traditional ways of Israel. And hadn't there been some incident in Jezreel that had caused a scandal? Perhaps the Queen Mother was just the wedge issue that Jehu needed to turn the people against the royal dynasty. He would have to think on that. When Jehu returned to the council, the others could tell that he had been shaken by what had happened in his private meeting. They also could not fail to notice the oil dripping from his eyebrows. "Is everything all right?" they wanted to know. Why did that madman come to you? He tried to brush it off, even as he took a cloth to wipe his face. Oh, you know that sort, and how they babble. But they saw through him immediately. They could tell that he had been shaken by the young man. "Liar! Liar!" they cried. "Come on, tell us what he had to say." So, in spite of his misgivings, he told them. And before he knew it, they had totally embraced the idea. They took off their cloaks and laid them on the ground for him. Someone found a war horn and began to blow it. Before he knew it, they were bowing before him and hailing him as king. The coup, it seemed, was on. And he's riding. The greater part of the army of Israel was up in Ramoth Gilead, guarding against an attack from the Arameans. But the king, Joram, had been wounded and returned to his country estate in Jezreel to rest and recuperate. It was the perfect time for Jehu to make a move when he was unable to call on troops loyal to him. The commander gathered up the chariot forces that were in Samaria. He would leave the infantry behind. If they were going to win this thing, they would have to move quickly. And so, within a few hours, Jehu was back in his happy place. His chariot was out nearly a half-mile ahead of the rest of the cavalry. His horses ran like the wind, while all the rest of his forces struggled to keep up. Once again the wind was in his hair, and the chariot was shaking and shimmying. There was a part of him who didn't even care how this whole thing turned out. He was just intoxicated with the sensation of finally acting on the feelings that he had kept pent up inside for so long. Jehu had managed to prevent any leaks ahead of his attack, and so, inside the walls of Jezreel, no one had a clue what was happening. But it was impossible to hide the dust cloud kicked up by approaching chariots. And so, even from a great distance, the sentries on the tower could tell that something was up. Following the procedures, a scout was quickly sent out on a fast horse to explore what was coming at them. As the scout approached, he recognized the chariot of the commander. Just before Jehu went charging by him in the opposite direction, he had the time to shout out a one-word question. "Shalom? Do you come in peace?" But the answer came swirling back through the cloud of dust. "What have you to do with peace? Fall in behind me." The scout had but a moment to consider his option. Having seen the determination and wild abandon with which Commander Jehu drove, the decision did not seem very difficult. He, too, had seen the inertia and indecision that had overtaken the court of the king. It seemed to him that Joram would never be able to resist what was coming against him. So the rider pulled on the reins, and by the time his horse had turned and was ready to follow, Jehu's chariot was already shrinking in the distance. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the sentries were puzzled. The scout had not returned, and the approaching army had not slowed. A second scout was quickly dispatched, but the results were the same. He also fell into place behind the lead chariot. This happened as Jehu rounded the final turn towards the main approach to the hill of Jezreel on one wheel. The commander on the wall couldn't make out the man's face at that distance, of course, but he suddenly had no doubt who it was. "It looks like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi," he cried, "for he drives like a maniac." "Jehu?" asked the soldier beside him. "Yes, that's right. We'd better tell the king." And he's driving. And he's driving. Urgent word was sent to the king that Jehu was coming, and that his intentions were questionable at best. Joram had been seriously wounded in skirmishes with the Arameans and had been resting up in bed. The king of Judah, a subordinate ruler from the south, had arrived to visit him just the day before. The two had been enjoying a friendly game of 30 houses by the king's bed. When Joram heard of Jehu's wild approach, he had a bad feeling about this. But there was no way that he was going to wait in his bed for fate to find him. He immediately ordered his chariot to be prepared, and informed the king of Judah that he should have his prepared as well, because he was coming along. When Jehu and his forces arrived in front of the palace, everyone wondered what would happen next. He did not have the forces to assault the palace, or even to besiege it. If he had attempted to do so, the army in Ramoth-Gilead would surely have arrived before the palace fell. The only thing to do in such a situation was to parley. Surely some sort of resolution could be worked out. The two kings rode out in their ceremonial chariots under a flag of truce to initiate some talks. And so it was that Jehu and Joram finally met outside the walls of the palace. They stood by the beautiful garden that Joram's father had planted on some land that his mother had obtained from a man named Naboth. The king had never understood why, but apparently some people had been upset about that when it had happened. The king did not step down from his chariot, but he extended his hand towards the military commander and asked a plaintive one-word question. "Ha-shalom? Is it peace? Do you come seeking the well-being of the entire nation?" But the answer was a clear no. What shalom can there be so long as the many prostitutions and sorceries of your mother Jezebel continue? Joram was shocked to hear his mother described in such terms. She was no prostitute. She was a royal princess, and she had never practiced any sorcery. He realized what Jehu was doing. It was propaganda of the worst sort. He was trying to turn Jezebel into a demon so foul that the people would accept any crime committed to remove her from power. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. People would accept it. That was how he came to understand that this truce was about to be broken. He grabbed the reins and whipped his horse desperately to a gallop. As he sped away, he cried out to the king of Judah, "It is treason, Ahaziah! Get out of here!" He didn't get far. Jehu was ready with his bow and shot Joram in the back as he fled. The king had had no time to put on any armor. The arrow pierced him right through and into his heart. Jehu sent his officers in pursuit of the king of Judah. He would not get much further than his lord. Jehu's men asked him what to do with the dead king. They assumed, at least, that he would have to be buried in the tomb of his fathers in Samaria. But Jehu had a different idea. "Leave him on the plot of ground of Naboth. I remember now. I was there, and so were some of you, when the prophet confronted him and uttered this oracle. For the blood of Naboth and for the blood of his children that I saw yesterday, says Yahweh, I swear that I will repay you on this very plot of land. So lift him out of his chariot and leave him there to rot." Jehu left them to carry out his orders. He had more pressing matters to attend to. Maniac. Jezebel waited inside the palace at Jezreel. She knew that her son, the king, was dead. Her women had been watching the terrible events from the roof. They had reported to her the approach of Jehu, the maniac, in his chariot. And when her son was shot down in cold blood by the old vineyard, they had run to her immediately with the dire news. The king was dead. Jezebel had always known who she was. She was the queen mother of Israel. She was the daughter of the king of Tyre. She knew that all of that was over now, but she was damned if she was going to go to her death as a sniveling coward. She did not even think of attempting an escape. She understood how futile that would be. Instead, she ordered that her finest gown of Tyrian purple be brought to her. She calmly sat down and waited while her women applied her makeup, painted her eyes, and affixed a royal headdress to her hair. If she was going to go out, she was going to go out as a queen. And so she stood at the window as Jehu entered into the palace courtyard. "Is it shalom? Is it for the well-being of the kingdom that you have come, Zimri, murderer of your master?" She felt satisfied to see Jehu visibly wince at that. Zimri had been the man who had carried out a disastrous coup against a previous king. He had survived merely 7 days on the throne before he himself had been replaced by Jezebel's father-in-law, whose dynasty was now at an end. Jezebel was implying that his coup would be just as successful, and he knew that. But he was in far too deep at this point for any second thoughts. He looked up to the window where the Queen Mother stood and called out, "Who is on my side? Who?" There are always opportunists who are ready to exploit the chaos. A couple of Jezebel's eunuchs looked out at Jehu, and when he said, "Throw her down," they didn't hesitate. The blood flew everywhere, on the wall and on the horses, who were so startled that they reared and trampled her. And with that, it was all over. Jehu left the bleeding, dying Queen Mother there and led his friends into the palace, where he lay down with them, and they consumed the feast that had been laid out for the former kings of Israel and Judah. The food was still warm, and the wine was chilled. When Jehu and his fellow conspirators had finished feasting, they thought to send some people to look for Jezebel's remains, thinking belatedly of treating them with a modicum of respect. But they were too late. The wild dogs of Jezreel had already gotten to her. All they had left behind were her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. Jehu seemed unconcerned. "This is the word of Yahweh," he said. "Didn't Elijah the Tishbite say it? In the territory of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel. The corpse of Jezebel shall be like dung on the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, 'This is Jezebel.'" And so, the story of Jezebel, Queen of Israel, came to a wretched end. She had been a powerful ruler in her own right, and her actions had reshaped the kingdom in many ways. As a foreigner, she had never been loved by the people. She had made many enemies, particularly among the company of the prophets. But you could certainly say one thing about her. She might not have a grave, but she would not be forgotten. Military coups are horrible things. They are bloody and destructive. They generally solve nothing and make things so much worse. And I think that the story of Jehu's coup, told in much more detail than any similar story in the Bible, bears that out. It is a bit distressing to see how the whole thing seems to have been engineered by the company of the prophets. Elijah first had the idea of using Jehu as their tool, receiving it as an order from God in a cave, though he himself doesn't seem to have followed through on that. It was his successor, Elisha, who kicked the whole thing off by sending a subordinate to do the anointing. But did the prophets come to regret their part in setting these terrible events in motion? The words of the prophet Hosea and his condemnation of the slaughter at Jezreel makes me think so. So, I don't think that the Bible truly portrays Jehu as a hero. He was an opportunist who readily adopted the prophetic complaints against Jezebel for his own selfish ends. He was a man who ruled as he drove his chariot, like a maniac, caring little for the fallout of his actions. Queen Jezebel has become today an icon of evil womanhood, at least in certain Christian circles. I said in a previous episode that I wasn't sure I understood that. She lived her life as a princess of her time was expected to. She married who she was told to marry and didn't make her way by seduction. She seems to have been forthright, with the notable exception of the whole Naboth affair. And yes, she was a patron of gods other than Yahweh, the God of Israel. But so were a lot of people, including many kings of both Israel and Judah. She doesn't seem to have introduced new Tyrian gods, but simply worshipped old Canaanite gods that had been well known. So why does she get singled out as the number one seducer who led Israel astray? It is not hard to assume that it's all just because she was a woman and she was a foreigner. But it was also because she was a convenient justification for Jehu's violent coup. He was the one who started the process of turning her into the worst monster in all of Scripture. And it seems to me that he did that primarily in service of very selfish goals, and ultimately brought about very dubious benefits for the people he would rule for a while. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening. Share the word by telling somebody else about this podcast. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Mainstream Music 2025 Volume 9 by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at endy.app, respectively. Additional vocals by yours truly. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. For more information on the historicity of Jehu's coup and how it may clash with the archaeological evidence, go to my show notes, which have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks to my friends on Patreon for your support, which means so much. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to join them in supporting this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.